The streets of Queens had a different feel that evening, the kind that brings back memories with every passing corner. The autumn air was getting chilly, and the streetlights were just starting to flicker on as 50 Cent drove his black Rolls-Royce through his old neighborhood. He wasn't there to make a scene or shoot a music video. This was personal. Behind the tinted windows, he smiled as he passed the basketball court where he used to practice his jump shot before music changed his life. The community center he'd been quietly funding for the past year was just a few blocks away. He liked to check in without announcement. It kept things real, let him see how things were actually running when no cameras were around. The center had become more than just another charity project. It was his way of giving kids the opportunities he never had growing up. As he turned onto the familiar street, red and blue lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror. 50 Cent let out a small sigh. He'd been through this before. He knew the drill. License, registration, remain calm. As he pulled over, he couldn't help but notice how the police cruiser stopped at an angle, lights blaring, making more of a show than necessary for a routine traffic stop. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach. Something about the way the officer walked, chest puffed out and hand resting unnecessarily on his holster, told 50 this wasn't going to be a typical stop. The rapper reached for his registration before the officer even reached his window, hoping to keep things smooth and professional. The tap on his window was harder than necessary. As 50 Cent lowered it, the cool evening air rushed in, along with the unmistakable attitude of an officer who had something to prove. License and registration, the officer demanded, not even attempting to hide his smirk of recognition. His nameplate caught the streetlight, but his body camera's usual red recording light was noticeably dark. People were already starting to gather on the sidewalk. In Queens, word traveled fast, and the sight of 50 Cent being pulled over was better than any reality TV show. Some had their phones out, recording what was about to unfold. The officer seemed to notice too, and something in his demeanor shifted, like an actor who just realized he had an audience. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. This wasn't about tinted windows anymore. This was about putting on a show, about having a story to tell at the precinct. As 50 Cent carefully opened his door, he could hear the murmurs from the onlookers, could feel the tension building in the air. The street where he once played as a kid was about to become a stage for something else entirely. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, trying to do something good for his community, only to find himself in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. But as he placed his hands where the officer could see them, 50 Cent was already thinking about something bigger than this moment. The community center just down the street wasn't just about giving kids a place to play basketball or do homework. It was about showing them a different way to handle life's challenges. As he stood there, feeling the eyes of the crowd and the officer's scrutiny, 50 Cent knew the situation was about to become either another statistic or something completely unexpected. The choice was his to make. The crowd was growing larger by the minute. Someone from the corner store had recognized 50 Cent's car and sent out a quick text. Now at least 30 people lined the sidewalk, phones raised high, waiting to see what would happen next. The streetlights cast long shadows across the scene, making everything feel more dramatic than it needed to be. The officer circled the Rolls-Royce like a shark, tapping his flashlight against the tinted windows. "You think you're above the law because you're famous," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice had that edge to it, the kind that comes from wanting to prove something. The officer's words weren't just meant for 50 Cent. They were for his audience, for the phones recording every moment, for the story he'd tell later. A teenager in the crowd whispered, "That's messed up." But the officer either didn't hear or didn't care. He was too busy putting on a show, making theatrical gestures as he inspected the vehicle. "I've heard your songs," the officer continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "All that tough talk about the streets. Let's see how tough you are now." 50 Cent stood perfectly still, his face calm despite the humiliation. He could feel the energy of the crowd shifting. Some were still filming, but others were getting angry, muttering under their breath. This was exactly the kind of situation that could spiral out of control fast. One wrong move, one wrong word, and tomorrow's headlines would write themselves. The officer began listing off 50 Cent's old lyrics, trying to embarrass him in front of everyone. What happened to many men? He taunted, referencing one of 50's most famous songs. Not so gangster now, are you? Some younger officers might have been fans, might have even grown up listening to his music, but this one had an axe to grind. People in the crowd were starting to get restless. A woman who looked like she just finished her shift at the hospital spoke up. He's just trying to check on the community center. But the officer waved her off, continuing his performance. More people were arriving, drawn by the commotion and the string of social media alerts lighting up phones across the neighborhood. The air was thick with tension as the officer made 50 Cent walk backward toward the curb. Every step was another small humiliation, another moment captured on dozens of phones. Some in the crowd had recognition dawn on their faces. They knew about the community center, about the good things happening there. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about respect, about power, about how quickly a situation could turn ugly. A group of kids who'd been playing basketball nearby stopped their game to watch. 50 Cent noticed them, saw the confusion and disappointment in their faces. These were the same kids he'd been trying to reach through the community center, the ones he wanted to show a better way. Now they were watching him being treated like a common criminal, and he knew his response would teach them more than any planned program ever could. The officer's radio crackled with routine traffic, but he ignored it, too invested in his moment of authority. "You got something to say?" he challenged, noticing 50 Cent's thoughtful expression. The crowd held their breath, phone steady, waiting for the response. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, and not just for the viral video that was surely coming. In the distance, sirens wailed. Heading somewhere else, another story unfolding in the city that never sleeps. But right here, right now, on this street in Queens, something important was about to happen. The next few moments would either add to the cycle of distrust and anger, or break it in a way no one expected. The cold concrete of the curb seeped through 50 Cent's designer jeans as the officer made him sit there, treating him like he was back on these streets, hustling instead of trying to make them better. The crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people now, their phones glowing like fireflies in the growing darkness. Some were live streaming, their whispered commentary adding to the tension in the air. "Let's see what we got here," the officer announced, making a show of putting on his latex gloves before beginning his search of the Rolls-Royce. He opened doors with unnecessary force, pulled out the floor mats, and tossed them aside like trash. Each movement was deliberate, designed to demonstrate his authority, to prove that money and fame didn't matter on these streets, at least not to him. A light drizzle started to fall, but nobody moved. The officer was now rifling through the glove compartment, reading out loud every document he found. "Oh, look at this," he said, waving a paper in the air. "Donation records for the community center. Playing the hero now, aren't we?" His words dripped with sarcasm, but they had an unintended effect. Several people in the crowd nodded knowingly, aware of the good changes happening in their neighborhood. 50 Cent remained seated, his expensive jacket getting damp from the rain, his face a mask of calm. But inside, his mind was racing. He thought about all the times he'd sat on curbs like this before he made it big, about how different things were supposed to be now. The kids from the basketball court were still watching, and he could see their young faces processing everything. The power dynamic, the humiliation, the choice between reaction and response. The officer's search grew more aggressive. He popped the trunk, pulling out gym bags and a box of children's books meant for the community center. "What's this?" he sneered, letting one of the books fall into a puddle. "Reading to kids now? That's not the 50 Cent I heard about." The crowd murmured with disapproval, but the officer was too caught up in his performance to notice how his actions were being received. A passing city bus slowed down, its passengers pressing against the windows to watch the scene unfold. The driver, an older man who'd probably seen it all on these streets, shook his head slowly before pulling away. The moment felt frozen in time, like one of those old photographs that capture a piece of history in the making. The rain started falling harder now, but still nobody moved. Water dripped down 50 Cent's face, but he didn't wipe it away. He kept his hands where they could be seen, his posture straight despite sitting on the curb. The officer's taunts continued as he inspected the car's engine compartment, making comments about dirty money and thugs trying to buy respect. From somewhere in the crowd, a grandmother's voice cut through the rain. "Let him be. He's doing good for our kids." Others joined in with murmurs of agreement, but the officer raised his hand for silence, his authority momentarily extending beyond 50 Cent to the whole street. The crowd fell quiet again, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something else, something that touched a nerve in everyone watching. The officer finally closed the hood of the Rolls-Royce with a slam that echoed down the street. He turned back to 50 Cent, clearly disappointed at finding nothing incriminating. Water dripped from his badge as he stood over the seated rapper, trying to maintain his dominance in a situation that was slowly slipping away from him. The moment of truth was approaching. How this would end was still up in the air, hanging like the heavy clouds above them. As the rain continued to fall, 50 Cent felt something familiar stirring inside him. That old anger he knew too well from his days on these very streets. It was the same feeling that had fueled so many of his songs, the same fire that had once made him react first and think later. The crowd could sense it too. They'd grown quieter, watching his face for any sign of the explosion they thought was coming. The water running down his back reminded him of another rainy night years ago when he'd sat on another curb, young and angry at the world. Back then, he would have jumped up, gotten in the officer's face, made headlines for all the wrong reasons. The old him was screaming inside, urging him to show this cop that he wasn't somebody to mess with. But something else was fighting against that anger now. Earlier that day, he received a letter from a kid at the community center, thanking him for the new basketball hoops and books. The letter was still in his jacket pocket, getting damp from the rain. The kid had written about wanting to be successful like you, but without all the fighting. Those words hit differently now, sitting here on this wet curb. He looked at the teenagers in the crowd, their phones still recording everything. What would they learn from this moment? If he lost his cool now, he'd be teaching them that nothing ever changes, that you can't rise above the streets no matter how far you go. The community center was supposed to show them a different path, but right now, they were watching to see if he still walked that old road. The officer was still talking, still trying to get a reaction, but 50's mind was somewhere else. He was thinking about his own son, about the conversations they'd had about dealing with disrespect. It's not about what they do, he told him. It's about who you choose to be. Those words echoed in his head now, competing with the angry voice from his past. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably his team hearing about what was happening, ready to turn this into a media circus. They'd want to call press conferences, demand the officer's badge, make this another example of power gone wrong. The old him would have loved that drama, would have fed off it, turned it into fuel for his next track. The rain had soaked through his clothes now, but he barely noticed. He was wrestling with something bigger than this moment, bigger than this street corner in Queens. Every kid watching, every phone recording, every person holding their breath. They were all waiting to see which 50 Cent would stand up from this curb. Would it be the fighter from the streets or someone new? He looked at the officer's nameplate again, studying the letters through the rain. Behind that badge was another story he didn't know. Maybe a father, maybe someone's son, maybe someone fighting their own battles. The anger was still there, but now it was mixing with something else. Curiosity. What made this man want to humiliate him? What story was he carrying? The crowd jumped as thunder rumbled overhead, but 50 Cent stayed still, letting the rain wash over him. He thought about all the beefs he'd had over the years, all the fights and feuds. Some had made him stronger, others had just made him tired. But none of them had ever really changed anything. Maybe that's what the kids at the community center needed to see, not another fight, but a new way forward. As lightning flashed across the Queen's sky, 50 Cent made his decision. The old him might not like it, but the man he was becoming knew exactly what needed to happen next. The real power wasn't in responding to disrespect with anger. It was in choosing a different path entirely. The rain was falling harder now, but 50 Cent slowly rose from the curb, his movements calm and deliberate. The crowd held their breath, phones still recording, expecting the explosion that usually came with such moments. But what happened next left everyone speechless. "How long have you been on the force?" 50 Cent asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. The question caught the officer off guard. It wasn't angry, wasn't challenging. It was genuine curiosity. The officer's hand instinctively moved toward his belt, but 50 kept his own hands visible, his body language open and non-threatening. The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the pavement. The officer seemed confused by this unexpected turn. He'd been ready for anger, for resistance, for the typical celebrity attitude. But this was different. 15 years, he finally answered, his voice losing some of its edge. "That's a long time to see the worst in people," 50 Cent said, nodding thoughtfully. "Must be tough on your family, coming home after dealing with all that." He gestured toward the community center down the street. "That's why I started this place. Trying to stop some of those problems before they start, you know." The crowd watched in amazement as 50 Cent stepped closer to the officer, still keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "You got kids?" he asked. The officer's stance shifted slightly, perhaps thinking of his own children at home. "Two," he replied, almost without meaning to. The rain continued to fall, but nobody moved. They were witnessing something rare, a moment when the script gets flipped completely. "Would you want them to see this video?" 50 Cent asked quietly, gesturing to the phones recording everything. "Not the part where you're doing your job, that's important. But the other stuff." He wasn't accusatory. His tone was more like someone sharing a hard truth with a friend. The officer's eyes scanned the crowd, really seeing them for the first time, seeing the kids watching everything unfold. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene, the expensive car with its contents scattered around, the crowd with their phones raised, and two men standing in the rain, having a conversation nobody expected. "I've made mistakes," 50 Cent continued, "done things I'm not proud of. But that's why I'm here now, trying to show these kids something different." The officer's radio crackled, but he didn't reach for it. Something was shifting in his expression, like ice slowly melting. "My son has your poster in his room," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the rain. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was something. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the person behind the badge. 50 Cent smiled, not the cocky smile from his album covers, but something more genuine. "Why don't you bring him by the center sometime? We've got some good programs starting up." He reached slowly into his wet jacket, pulling out the Saudi children's book that had fallen earlier. "We're teaching kids that strength isn't about who can shout the loudest or look the toughest." The crowd was still filming, but the story they were capturing had changed completely. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about something else, something more important. The officer looked at the book in 50 Cent's hand, then at the community center down the street, then back at the man standing before him. The rain kept falling, but the tension in the air was dissolving, replaced by something that felt a lot like hope. The rain had settled into a gentle drizzle as 50 Cent and the officer moved under the awning of a nearby store. The crowd stayed put, but they'd lowered their phones slightly, more interested now in listening than recording. Something real was happening, something more powerful than any viral video. You know, the officer started, his voice different now, more human. I grew up not far from here. He glanced down the street, past the community center, toward the older buildings beyond. Used to be rougher back then. His admission hung in the air, a small piece of common ground in what had started as a confrontation. 50 Cent nodded, understanding in his eyes. Still is, for some of these kids. That's why we got the center. But it's not just about keeping them off the streets. He gestured toward the scattered books on the ground. It's about showing them possibilities. Showing them they can be more than what these streets expect them to be. The officer picked up one of the wet books, turning it over in his hands. My partner and I responded to a call last week, he said quietly. Kid, couldn't have been more than 15, lying there. He stopped, emotions flickering across his face. Sometimes it feels like nothing changes, you know. I know that feeling, 50 Cent replied, watching a group of teenagers who were still recording everything. But change happens. Maybe not all at once, but it happens. Last month, we had a kid get accepted to college. First one in his family. That's change. Small, but real. The crowd had grown quieter, straining to hear the conversation. Many were nodding, recognizing their own stories in these words. The officer looked at them too, really seeing them now, not as a threat or an audience, but as a community. My son, the officer said, his voice catching slightly, he wants to be a rapper. His mother hates it, says it's not a real career. He laughed softly, the sound carrying a hint of embarrassment. I used to think the same way. Used to see guys like you as part of the problem. 50 Cent smiled, but his eyes were serious. And now? He asked, genuinely curious about the answer. The officer looked down at the book in his hands, then back at the community center. Now, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. His honesty was powerful, unexpected. A young boy in the crowd spoke up, his voice clear in the damp air. Officer, you should come see our music program at the center. Instead of shutting the kid down, the officer turned, really looking at him. The boy continued, excited now. We're learning about production and business too, not just rapping. That's right, 50 Cent added. We're teaching them that music is about more than just making noise. It's about telling your story, about business, about building something real. He paused, letting his words sink in. Kind of like being a police officer, it's about more than just wearing the badge, right? The officer nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. The conversation had moved beyond the traffic stop, beyond the humiliation attempt, into something more meaningful. The crowd felt it too. Phones were being lowered, people were stepping closer, becoming part of the dialogue rather than just witnesses. The night was getting deeper, but nobody seemed ready to leave. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets with that fresh, clean smell that comes after a storm. 50 Cent looked at his watch, then at the community center down the street. A thought crossed his mind, one that could either make or break this whole situation. Why don't we take a walk? He suggested to the officer, gesturing toward the center. I was heading there anyway. Might as well show you what we're doing. The invitation hung in the air like the last drops of rain. The officer hesitated, looking at his patrol car, then back at 50 Cent. I should probably write up this stop, the officer said, but his voice lacked conviction. The paperwork, the citation for tinted windows. It all seemed small and unimportant now. 50 Cent smiled, understanding the unspoken conflict. The center's open late on Thursdays. Music program runs until 9. You could write it up as community outreach. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Some people were already heading that way, sensing something special was about to happen. The officer touched his radio, then made a decision. Dispatch, taking a community walk, will be at the youth center. The response crackled back, formal and routine, but this was anything but routine. They walked together, rapper and officer, followed by a smaller crowd now, mostly kids and a few parents. 50 Cent pointed out the new basketball courts they'd installed last month. Had some kids sleeping in the doorway when we first opened, he explained. Now they're in our midnight basketball program instead. Funny how things work out. The officer noticed the security cameras, the good lighting, the clean sidewalks. This must have cost a fortune, he said, professional interest mixing with surprise. 50 Cent nodded. Worth every penny. But you know what cost the most? He paused at the entrance. Getting people to trust us. Getting them to believe things could be different. Inside, the sound of music drifted from the studio room, someone practicing their beats, laying down tracks about their own life story. The officer took it all in. The study room where kids were getting homework help, the computer lab teaching coding, the wall of college acceptance letters. My son, the officer started, then stopped, emotion catching in his voice. He'd love this place. 50 Cent watched a group of teenagers working on their productions, their faces lit up with concentration. Bring him by, he said simply. We're always looking for new talent. And maybe, he paused, choosing his words carefully, maybe you could talk to some of our kids too. Help them see the person behind the badge. The officer looked around again, seeing everything differently now. The kids weren't potential threats anymore. They were just kids, trying to find their way, just like his own son. You know, he said slowly, when I started my shift today, I thought I knew exactly who you were. Thought I knew exactly what this neighborhood needed. 50 Cent nodded, understanding. That's the thing about judging books by their covers, he said, picking up a program brochure from the front desk. Sometimes the story inside is different than what you expect. He handed the brochure to the officer, who took it automatically, still taking in everything around him. The night had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. What started as an attempt at humiliation had become an opportunity for real change. The center buzzed with life around them, proof that different worlds could come together, that bridges could be built in the most unexpected ways. By morning, the videos were everywhere. But they weren't what anyone expected. Instead of another viral moment of conflict, the clips showed something different, something that made people stop scrolling and watch again. The footage captured more than just a traffic stop. It showed a transformation happening in real time. Local news vans started showing up outside the community center at dawn. Reporters stood in front of the building, talking about an unexpected encounter that had turned into something powerful. Their cameras focused on the basketball courts, the study rooms visible through the windows, the steady stream of people coming to see the place for themselves. Did you see it? People asked each other on the subway, on buses, in corner stores across the city. The way he handled it. The clips were being shared with messages like, "This is how you break the cycle," and "Real strength isn't about fighting back." Each share, each repost added to the story, turning it into something bigger than just one night in Queens. Inside local diners, people watched the videos on their phones over coffee and breakfast. "That's the community center my nephew goes to," one waitress told her customers proudly. Been trying to tell people about the good things happening there. The customers nodded, seeing their city differently now, seeing possibilities they hadn't considered before. The moment when 50 Cent stood up from the curb became a meme, but not the kind that mocks. People paired it with captions about choosing peace, about finding new ways to handle old problems. Young people shared it with messages about respect, about breaking cycles of violence, about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who tried to humiliate you. By midday, national news picked up the story, but they struggled to fit it into their usual narratives. This wasn't about conflict or celebrity privilege or police overreach. It was about something else, something more hopeful. The headlines kept changing as editors tried to capture what had really happened. 50 Cent turns traffic stop into teaching moment, or unexpected encounter leads to community connection. Parents started calling the center, asking about programs for their kids. "My son saw the video," they'd say, and he actually wants to get involved. The phone didn't stop ringing. Other community leaders calling to learn more. Other police departments asking about building bridges. Other artists wondering how they could help. Social media experts tried to analyze why the video had gone viral. It's authentic, one explained on a morning show. People are tired of seeing the same old conflicts. This shows another way. The clips kept spreading, but they weren't just being shared. They were being discussed in homes, in schools, in police precincts. The most powerful reactions came from the kids who'd been there that night. They wrote about it in school essays, talked about it in class discussions. "I always thought you had to fight back," one teenager told his teacher. But what if fighting back sometimes means staying calm and changing the whole game? Local businesses near the center started noticing changes too. More customers, more community feeling, more hope in the air. The owner of a small coffee shop put up a sign, "Choose peace like 50 did." It wasn't about celebrity worship. It was about recognizing a moment when someone chose to be bigger than the situation, and the ripple effects that choice could have. 2 weeks after that rainy night, the community center buzzed with unusual energy. Kids pressed their faces against the windows, watching as a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. The same officer who had tried to humiliate 50 Cent stepped out, but this time he wasn't alone. His son was with him, clutching a notebook and trying not to look too excited. Inside, the recording studio had been transformed. New equipment lined the walls, and a group of teenagers huddled around a mixing board, working on their latest track. The officer's son's eyes went wide at the sight, taking in everything he'd dreamed about but never thought he'd see up close. 50 Cent was there, sitting casually on a studio chair, helping a young producer adjust some levels. He looked up when the officer and his son entered, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Right on time," he said, standing to greet them. The teenagers in the room fell silent, watching this moment unfold. The same officer who had caused such a scene now standing there, looking both official and somehow human in his uniform. The officer's son couldn't contain himself. "Is that a real professional mixing board?" He burst out, then immediately looked embarrassed at his outburst. 50 Cent laughed, warm and real. "Come check it out," he said, waving the boy over. "Your dad told me you've been making beats on your laptop. Let's hear what you got." As his son rushed forward, the officer stayed back, watching. He saw how the other kids in the room gradually relaxed, how they started showing his son their own projects, how the barriers he'd spent years seeing everywhere just weren't there. 50 Cent caught his eye and nodded toward a room across the hall, where another group of teens sat with a different kind of visitor. "That's our new program," 50 Cent explained quietly. "Getting officers in here to talk with the kids. Not lectures, just conversations. Real talk about real life." The officer watched as his colleagues, officers he'd worked with for years, sat with the teenagers, everyone leaning in, really listening to each other. The transformation wasn't just in the center. Word had spread through the department about what happened that night. Officers were requesting to be assigned to the neighborhood, wanting to be part of something different. The old way of doing things, the suspicion, the hostility, the us versus them mentality, was slowly being replaced by something new. Back in the studio, the officer's son had pulled out his phone, playing a beat he created. The other kids were nodding along, offering suggestions, adding their own ideas. 50 Cent stood back, letting it happen naturally. This was what he'd envisioned when he started the center, not just a place to keep kids off the streets, but a place where real connections could happen. "You know," the officer said, watching his son light up as he shared his music, "I almost called in sick today. Thought it would be too weird, coming back here after everything." 50 Cent understood. "But you came anyway," he said. "That's what it's all about. Showing up, being real, giving things a chance to change." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in the air, making everything look a little magical. In one corner, future producers worked on their beats. In another, kids and cops talked about life. And in the middle of it all, an officer who had tried to humiliate a rap star stood watching his son find his voice, realizing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. As the day wound down, 50 Cent looked around the center, at the mix of uniforms and hoodies, at the conversations happening in every corner, at the music bringing everyone together. This was more than just a happy ending to a viral moment. This was proof that change was possible, that bridges could be built, that the streets that had once divided them could become the ground where they all met as equals.